It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Growth is the number one priority of this government. Of course, we also have climate commitments, but growth is really important to our agenda. That's why I've had this engagement this morning. That's why I've got a big speech coming up from the Chancellor.
Is growth at all costs the right landing place for the UK economy?
The release of DeepSeek AI from a Chinese company should be a wake-up call for our industries.
The success of a free Chinese AI app sends US tech stocks tumbling. Is China winning the artificial intelligence wars? After last summer's riots, a Home Office report recommends recording more non-crime hate incidents, but the government rejects it.
There are countries right next door to us. There's one country, France, that has a very, very different way of funding the NHS. And their returns on stroke, heart and cancer are better than ours for exactly the same sum of money.
Nigel Farage during the election campaign, but now the Health Secretary has called his prescription for the NHS miserablist. Who's right? Joining us today, Labour MP Polly Billington, Tees Valley Mayor and Tory peer Ben Houchin, Naomi Smith from the pro-EU think tank Best for Britain and the chairman of Reform UK, Zia Yusuf. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this BBC News headline on a story you saw there in our own headlines. China's DeepSeek AI shakes industry and dents America's swagger. Quite the headline. It's the story that the Chinese AI company DeepSeek has become the most downloaded free app in the US just a week after it launched, sending US rivals into freefall and wiping almost $600 billion off the market value of chipmaker Nvidia. It was made at the fraction of the cost of its US rivals too. President Trump said the rise of DeepSeek was a wake-up call. Let's have a listen.
Today and over the last couple of days, I've been reading about China and some of the companies in China, one in particular, coming up with a faster method of AI and much less expensive method. And that's good because you don't have to spend this much money. I view that as a positive. The release of DeepSeek AI from a Chinese company should be a wake-up call for our industries that we need to be laser-focused on competing to win, because we have the greatest scientists in the world.
My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Polly, is China winning the AI war?
Well, I think what you've got to look at with DeepSeek is that it takes all of your data. It doesn't tell you the truth. We don't know what kind of standards it was developed under, and we don't know whether it respects intellectual property. So if that's the way that AI is going, we should be setting some standards in terms of making sure that when we do AI, we do it much better and much more properly, because people need to rely on this technology. And if it's taking all of your data and it's not telling the truth, if you ask who is Tank Man in Tiananmen Square, it won't tell you. So that also points out that it doesn't respect our values of free speech.
Right, so should it be banned here?
Well, I don't think as much as it needs to be banned, but I think we do need to make sure that when we're developing our AI industry here, we're developing it with good and strong standards.
Right, but you can see how popular it is.
Yeah, but you'll end up with a race to the bottom. And frankly, people will start to see that those things are not reliable, and therefore we need to be able to make sure that our stuff is better.
Ben Houchin, what do you think? Is China winning the AI war, or should we think about restricting it?
I think the reality is it's too early to tell. What yesterday did is it certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons that everybody thought that China was quite a long way behind. There is still some evidence to look at how have they actually done this and the power behind it. There are some suggestions that the chips that they've been using probably break some trade embargoes with China, so they're under-reporting the chip usage, which has obviously had a huge impact on Nvidia. But what is true is they do seem to have found a more efficient way of coding. And one of the benefits is it's open source. So I know the Americans, and we're looking at this as to how we can kind of look at accelerating that curve. It's too early to tell, but Trump is right. It's a wake-up call to the West, because AI and this technology is going to be a huge driver in decades to come. There is, in effect, a tech war going on, and hopefully it's a wake-up call that we can make sure that we book our ideas up and China aren't the winners of this race.
Right, I mean, why isn't Britain in this race?
Well, one of the reasons we're not in this race is for a long, long time we were shackled to the EU, and the regulation, the over-regulation of industries like this are a huge problem. Now, we're already seeing this with the way that the EU are looking to approach AI as we speak. Now we have a problem that if you're looking to locate this technology here, we're going to talk about growth in a little bit, but
yes,
actually building these things here, getting these things over the line quickly, which is what tech want to do and deploy quickly, is still a barrier to growth. That's not happening elsewhere, particularly in America.
Well, the shackles are off now. We're not in the EU.
Well, I'm afraid they're not, because while we have the talent here in the UK, certainly, we have amongst the top researchers and designers in the world. Without the capital markets, any decent UK startup gets invested in by Americans. It doesn't float here in the UK, and we lose all of the entrepreneurial benefit out of the UK. And so what government really needs to be looking at is how to ensure that our capital markets can flourish. When we look at the number of IPOs that have happened here in the UK over the last few years, it's been dismal. And that needs to change. At the moment, it's really not obvious how, if you've got a great AI tool, a product that you're developing, that you can scale it within the UK. That's the issue.
Right. I mean, is China, though, winning the AI war for now?
Well, I'm really glad you asked why the UK isn't competing. There's one main reason, and that is the insane energy prices in this country. Anyone who understands AI knows the biggest limiting factor for compute and all of the things we're talking about to make an AI superpower, of which the UK should be, and reform under Nigel Farage will make the UK an AI superpower, is energy prices. If you're in doubt about that, the top 5 US tech companies have 40% of the energy capacity of the United Kingdom already, the equivalent of. Within 7 years, 5 private companies in America will have more energy capacity than the United Kingdom. Ed Miliband is continuing the crazy enshrinement into law of these net zero targets. Look, we all want to breathe clean air, but we are unilaterally disarming in this country. The energy prices that British people and British companies have to pay are a catastrophe. We have to stop the net zero madness.
I mean, Polly, of course, used to work for Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary. What do you say in response to that? That's the reason that we're not in this race.
Well, it's complete nonsense. For a start off, we're setting up an energy council specifically with Ed Miliband and Peter Kyle, who is the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, in order to be able to develop the right kind of strategy to support the energy that we need. And I would say to Zia, the point is the future of growth in this country is going to be net zero. If we don't do that, you turn your back on the future and you end up dependent further on polluting oil and gas. The reliance on Putin's oil and gas, and reduces energy security as well as prevents us from being able to reduce costs over time. So I just think it's a set of wrong choices that you're suggesting in order for us that would end up with us not being able to compete on AI or indeed on any other kind of growth that we're talking about.
Can you name me a country in Europe that has lower energy prices than the UK?
Do you know what? I don't have the retail prices of all the energy across Europe, so I'm not going to answer that question.
We have the most expensive energy, 36 pence per kilowatt hour, of any country in Europe, more expensive than almost any country in the world.
Well, wouldn't you
so long as that is true, anyone watching this at home or knows anything about AI will understand, with respect, so long as that is true, we are not only not going to be able to compete, we'll be at the bottom of the pile. And this stuff matters.
Aren't we supposed to be trying to invest in energy so in order to be able to reduce costs, increase energy security and clean up our energy system? Those are the commitments of this government, and that is what we will do. And we will do that alongside being able to develop AI, because we have an energy council specifically designed in order to be able to support the energy investment that we need to support that industry.
Well, let's talk about growth. We started already, really, because that is the big push. If you haven't heard from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, let's have a look at the headline here in the Financial Times. UK revives plan for Oxford-Cambridge arc. Government aims to double economic output of science-rich region between Britain's 2 best-known universities. Now, the plan would build transport links and housing, developing that corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, and the government says it wants to double the economic output of the region. It was originally devised, this plan, by the National Infrastructure Commission, but was shelved in 2022 by the Boris Johnson government. Ben, Boris Johnson cancelled, or certainly shelved, this plan because his levelling up agenda meant he wanted to focus investment efforts on projects, particularly in the north of England and where you represent. What do you make of the fact that the government has revived it?
Well, both of those things can be true. You know, the South and the South East can succeed, and we can have a domestic industrial policy and a plan to be able to level up the whole country.
So Boris Johnson was wrong to shelve it then?
I agree. I absolutely agree with that. In the same way, I'm sure we're going to talk about Heathrow,
both can be true. He obviously
for instance.
decided to go for one part of the country that he felt needed levelling up.
But again, that's a very prescribed way of doing it. And other than Teesside, there wasn't a huge amount of levelling up that ended up getting delivered. In the same way, I'm sure we're going to get on to Heathrow third runway. Yeah. It's not just about Heathrow, right? Why? Yeah, let's build the third runway, but also build one at Manchester and Leeds. Why does it have to be restricted? And it's very much by diktat that the centre is allowing, because of over-regulation, to say, we're going to allow you to do this, we're going to allow you to do that.
Right.
So it is a major problem. But if you also look, the Cambridge Arc has been a major problem for a long time. It's one thing saying it and decreeing it. This government does a lot of this. It decrees a lot of things. But I understand the reality of how to get these things done. And unless they're going to blow up things like the Environment Agency, Natural England, various planning rules, make it less democratic to local people, then they will not be able to get this through. So if they're going to do it, fine. I'm actually quite supportive of this government's agenda on growth, but they also have to be upfront with the public about how that has to happen if they're going to deliver the things they say they're going to deliver.
Are you going to blow up all those things to get it done?
What we're going to do is we're going to change the planning rules, which I think there might be not much that Ben and I agree on, but I think we would agree that the planning rules and the planning framework that we've got at the moment doesn't achieve what we need to. It doesn't achieve the growth we need, it doesn't achieve the homes we need, nor indeed does it protect the nature that we need. And that's why we need to be able to have a different approach to being able to do this. Partly it's about saying this is where we need to have homes, this is where we need to protect nature, this is where we need energy infrastructure. That as well as of course protecting our vital food production in farmland. Without that set of frameworks and those rules, we end up with the endless contestation of every single project, and that ends up slowing down growth and not actually giving people like Ben as a mayor the opportunity to shape the places that they ostensibly are in charge of.
Sorry, Poppy. The biggest issue you're going to have, and you say about protecting nature, we've seen in the news in recent months about the bat tunnel on HS2. I can give you numerous bat tunnel examples in Teesside
but that's because the current rules, which is what we're very
those
happy
current
to
rules
change
are not planning rules. Those are planning rules that are actually because of statutory stakeholders, i.e. people that have to have a decision, like the Environment Agency and Natural England. Actually, there are examples where the Environment Agency are taking decisions that are bad for the environment because of the regulations they have. And this is why it's important that this government's got to deliver this, because you and other journalists and potentially some other political parties will turn around and say, if you rip up the rules that you actually do have to rip up to do this thing, you are going to get hammered for saying you're destroying the environment. And there's got to be a grown-up conversation about, are the regulations in place actually protecting the environment? Are they stopping growth? Are they stopping jobs? Are they stopping places like mine levelling up?
Will you rip up the rules? Will you rip up the rules that are a block to growth in Ben Houchin's experience?
I think we're going to have to change them. The £10 million bat tunnel that we're talking about is a really good example where some...
It's 100 million.
£100 million bat tunnel. Forgive me for my lack of noughts. And the £100 million bat tunnel was a really good example where somebody said no bat should die as a result of this piece of infrastructure. Well, that is not something that any regulator should be able to say. We need to be able to balance these things appropriately, and we need to be able to protect nature, not just because it's nice to look at, but because it's actually vital for our economic growth. If you represent a place like mine, surrounded by the sea, people come here to come to my community in order to be able to enjoy the environment. We need to protect it for that reason, if for no other reason.
Right, so should growth come at the expense of environmental concerns, Sia?
It's clear that what this country needs is actually to start growing again.
Yeah.
Whether it's 0.1% negative or 0.1%
I think everyone agrees
it's
with that.
irrelevant. So we need total transformation of the planning laws. We need, yes, of course, we want clean air. Look, we are putting solar panels in this country across large aspects of the green belt.
No, we're not.
Just
not true.
That bat tunnel, the United Kingdom pays 13 times more per mile of high-speed rail than France and than China. And the biggest reason for that are things like the Environmental Agency. Yes, of course, we have to protect nature, but that is not what these agencies are doing anymore. They are activists. They are actively impeding growth in this country. And by the way, most of this happened under the Tory government. It proliferated under them. All Labour are doing is pouring gasoline onto a fire that is already burning. We need real growth in this country.
Right. Do you agree with that? And also this idea that levelling up might be put to one side, whether you believe it happened or not under Boris Johnson, because you've got a Labour government backing this big project between Oxford and Cambridge, or reviving it, an area that's already relatively affluent. Tomorrow we're going to hear the Chancellor give her speech, reportedly somewhere again in Oxfordshire. What does that say to voters in parts of the country, many of whom came back to Labour having previously voted for the Tories?
specifically on East-West Rail, the Oxford to Cambridge arc, should have happened a decade ago. Absolutely fanciful and ridiculous that anyone has shelved it. It should happen at pace. We should get that done. When we look at things like the housing crisis that we have in the UK, which is both a supply issue and a quality issue in other parts of the country, we know that build-out rates around new infrastructure are much faster than they are elsewhere. So new infrastructure development for transport will deliver more homes. That's good. But on the specific issue of this binary either-or on growth or levelling up, I don't buy it. It's not true. If this government is honest in its ambitions for growth, it will do one thing very, very well in the next year, and that is to go to the EU during the reset of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is happening this year, and talk about a deep alignment in goods. If you have deep alignment between the UK and the EU on goods, that is how you will get the proceeds of growth distributed across the country. Why goods? Because London and the South East is dominated by services.
Yes.
The rest of the country, not exclusively, but is where a lot of our goods production is happening. We've got companies that have now just given up on exporting to Northern Ireland, let alone the rest of the EU. And trade with the rest of the world is not compensating for it. We're becoming less trade intensive as a country. That is impinging growth. And I think this government would do the right thing in going into those negotiations to say, let's talk about how we can get rid of all of that red tape at the border.
You're shaking your head, Zia.
I find it extraordinary how the political class in this country still cannot bring themselves to admit that there's a demand problem with regards to the housing crisis in this country. We talk about supply. What about the demand? So if you look over the last 3 years, 2 million net new people arrived in the country. The country built 600,000 new homes. It's as good as we've done in several decades. You take Labour's existing target to build 1.5 million new homes. By their own statistics, we're going to add 2.5 million net new people in that time. So we're building nowhere near enough homes, even if they hit that target, which they won't for the reason we just described. And then we look at what's happened today in terms of the ONS, who have said we're going to add another 5 million net new people. That is net migration staying at 700,000 per year. There is no way we are ever going to build enough homes to cater for that demand. And we are never even talking about it. Reform are the only party who actually understand that the housing crisis in this country is a supply and a demand problem.
There is also major vacancies across the construction sector, and has been for a very, very long time. Young British people are simply not choosing to go into those professions. You ask any of the major organisations that represent the construction sector, they are saying the jobs are there. These are good jobs. These are good jobs outside of London and in other parts of the country. But we have both a skills issue and then an inclination issue to go into these roles. And that, I'm afraid, is part of the issue about why we need to talk about Europe and the relationship with Europe, and perhaps some kind of youth mobility scheme for young people in order to try and fill some of those vacancies.
Is the population explosion not an issue then? You do not think that the population explosion, net migration staying at 700,000 a year, you don't think that's a problem contributing to the housing crisis?
What we have had in this country is a very serious housing problem for a very, very long time, far longer than we've seen large levels of migration over the last decade or so. It predates that. I couldn't get on the housing ladder when I first started working. That was a very long time ago. What we've got to think about is both the quality issue in certain parts of the country as well as the supply side and the pressures on that demand. And what we've got in this country is we have poorly managed population growth. When we look at other countries who have done it much better, I would look at Canada for that as an example of how to manage population change in a much less laissez-faire way than we've had from
ratings would suggest that he's done a good job.
All right, well, let's just, I would like to get, well, I'd like to get a response, first of all, to the idea of embracing the EU far more closely in order to at least get a deal on goods that would mean for manufacturers it would be far more profitable. Do you agree with that?
So, if you don't mind, Jo, just very, very quickly on that last point, because it's really important. The idea that we should compensate the fact that apparently young people aren't that interested in going to construction with inward migration is not a reason to be closer to the EU. It's a failure of the UK government and the state to be able to help people realise the opportunities within that. Correct. To be able to outsource that and say, well, look, that's still a problem, but what we're going to do is import people is not the answer.
And that was Tory governments, of course.
Absolutely. I'm not shying away from that one bit, but that is going to be continuing being acute. The second issue, and we talked about levelling up and growth as well, we're now seeing under this government increasingly people coming into this country, low-skilled migration, who are increasingly a burden on public services. And what are people in the south and south? What are councils in the south and southeast doing? They're moving them up to the north in places like mine where it's cheaper. That's putting an even greater burden on the people that I represent on lower wages. And it's just not sustainable. It's just not something we can allow to happen, and this government needs to get a grip on it.
Well, Polly, what are you going to do about that? I mean, it's interesting hearing that sort of personal experience from Ben in the North East.
Well, I think people voted in 2019. They voted Conservative because they got a promise of levelling up, right? They voted for us in 2024 because they were very deeply disappointed. And that's not just in the North, where Ben is. It includes places like...
But they still might want that levelling up.
Well, yes, exactly. And
but everything looks focused on the South and South East.
That growth benefits everywhere. And that's why we need to be making sure that we have homes in the right places, that we've got manufacturing in the right places, £22 billion worth of carbon capture and storage investment in Ben's part of the world.
What about the question on immigration that Ben...
Those things are important, and they produce skilled jobs for people in communities that previously were completely neglected by the failure of Boris to deliver on his
and that means you would lower the levels of net migration?
Well, if we've got people doing the jobs here, then yes, we will be able to do that. And we've already said that we would want to be able to lower the levels of net migration as people increase their skills in this country.
Is there
That's why we've committed to Skills England as well.
Right.
And particularly, Naomi's point about the construction sector, whatever you say about the aptitude and inclination, and I agree with you, I believe in our young people and they are prepared to go and do those jobs, but we still have a big gap, and building the homes that we need, that will be a big issue, and we need to be able to skill people up.
Well, sharing the...
just said that the population in this country, we're going to have 5 million net new people.
I think it's about 330,000
is the forecast. People living longer, it's people getting divorced and living apart, it's people having different lifestyles as well. I think we need to acknowledge that people live in a very different way from when most of our homes were built.
How does someone's different lifestyle affect population growth?
Well, because of where they choose to live, how close they are to where they live, how big they want their homes to be, who they choose to live with, where their children are, whether they need to share responsibility for their children, how old they are. All of those things change the kind of homes we need to have. And those kind of things mean that we need to think about building those homes in the right places, in the right design, for the right people.
That's an issue of dispersal of people and concentration
of people. That's also important in terms of economic growth.
And I absolutely agree, that's one thing, but the overarching factor that is going to override this government for the next 4 or 5 years is net migration adding to the total population at the scale that is predicted is not going to be sustainable and is going to cause this government all sorts of problems, potentially with community cohesion. There's going to be a big breakdown coming in the future. I mean, Zia's here, Reformer all over this, right? They're not going away. It has to be grappled with. We can't pretend that it's all going to be OK. We have to answer these difficult questions.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, and committed to skilling up our young people so that they can fulfil those jobs, and we will not need nearly as much people coming in to do those jobs.
We don't yet have a timetable for that, and of course Kemi Badenoch hasn't said exactly the net migration figure that she would like to see. Can I ask about Heathrow? Is that now definitely A, on the cards, and B, you would support it? Third runway.
Well, I don't know whether it's on the cards or not. Nobody's made an announcement yet, have they? So
no, but would you be? No, it's fine. But all the indications are there, Polly, that there would be expansion. If you're going for growth, does it make sense to have a third runway at Heathrow and expand Luton and Gatwick?
Well, we need to do it within the commitments we've already made to making sure that we have a net zero economy, because that's the way that we will have growth, long-term, sustainable growth in the future. And as long as it's consistent with that, which involves a certain amount of mitigation, needs to think about noise pollution, needs to think about air pollution, needs to think about transport links, all of those things, and indeed what we do with our regional airports, because those are vital for economic growth, then I can't see then we'll be able
to Heathrow expansion?
Absolutely. But also the expansion to Leeds, Bradford, Teesside, Manchester. I mean, Andy Burnham.
But that hasn't been mentioned in
because that's a very London-centric view of the world that Heathrow's going to solve the problem. But just very, very quickly.
Yes.
We've got a flight path between Teesside and Heathrow.
Unfortunately, not at the minute, but we will if there's an expansion. Now, what I would say is it's a bit of the government are trying to Svengali this and misdirect people, because yes, Heathrow expansion is good, but it's not going to come about anytime soon. It's not really going to move the dial in relation to GDP growth in the overall scale of things in 10 years' time if it gets up and running. And it's masking with a single project the underlying problems with this economy. And they're saying, look over here, because we're not really sure they're going to change the fundamentals of the economy and help us grow as a nation.
Let's just briefly go into the Commons, because the Home Office Minister, Dan Jarvis, is just sitting down. He has been responding to an urgent question from the Shadow Home Secretary. You can see there now Chris Philp, who put in a question about the rapid review into expanding the government's definition of terrorism. It was commissioned by the Home Secretary in the wake of the South Southport attacks. It's been leaked, or part of it has been leaked. You can see this headline in The Times: alert over dizzying range of extremism. Home Office review urges sweeping changes. But then there is also this response in the BBC News that ministers have rejected the call to widen extremism definition. Well, as I've said, this is a leak. We haven't had sight of the full report. Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Henry, what sort of picture have we got exactly of this review and the government's reaction to it?
Well, as you say, Jo, we haven't seen this report ourselves. A version of it has been leaked to Policy Exchange, a right-leaning think tank. Though, worth stressing, I don't think the government is quibbling with what Policy Exchange say is in there. This was a report conducted not by some external agency, but by the government's own officials. And yet it is being disowned by government ministers today. What did the report suggest the government did? Well, there's quite a lot in there, but the thing that's attracted most controversy is that the report suggested to the government that it should look less at the ideologies of potential extremists, but at their actions. Now, critics and I think supporters of that approach say that would mean lots more people like potentially dangerous environmentalists or extreme misogynists would be captured by the government's counter-extremism policies. Critics of that approach would say that's exactly the point. It would mean deprioritising the current focus areas of far-right extremism and Islamist extremism. But the crucial point is that fertile debate, the government is trying to curtail that debate and saying, even though they commissioned this from their own officials who continue to work on counter-extremism for the government, they disagree with it and they won't be enacting it.
Right. Henry, thank you very much for that. Can I just come to you, Polly, first of all, in response? What do you make of what the government has done in reaction to this leaking of this partial report?
Well, like Henry, I haven't seen the report either, but it does seem to me to make sense. And I sort of slightly dispute Henry's interpretation of this as like closing down debate. They commissioned a report. They got the recommendations from the report. They decided they didn't like the recommendations.
Well, hang on, they haven't said all of them, have they? I mean, it does look as if they are shutting down debate.
It's reasonable to say, well, having looked at what they've come up with, we don't want to dilute it. We think the key priorities need to be Islamic extremism and far-right extremism, so we're going to carry on with those priorities.
Well, then what was the point of having a report? But hang on, what was the point? Except that we know from the Prime Minister himself, and I paraphrase his words, but he said in response to what happened in Southport and Axel Rudakabana being convicted, is that there seemed to be a problem with lone operators in their rooms, consumed and fuelled by hate, but not perhaps a specific ideology, be it religious or political. And surely this review is saying, yes, that needs to be part of the picture when it comes to a definition of extremism.
But some of those other aspects we're approaching in different ways, like, for example, tackling misogynistic hate crime and sexual offences and domestic abuse. Tackling violence against women and girls is already being done with a big programme in this country, and therefore we may not need to include that in terms of the terror definition that we've got. If the Home Office has decided that those two are the key priorities, there may well need to be other things that would come out of the public inquiry into the Southport killing, which explores other ways we might need to be able to deal with that kind of violence. But this report has the Home Office has decided there is no need to be able to change the definition.
No need or not enough resource?
Well, it might be a bit of both. I don't know. But like I say, I haven't read it any more than Henry has. But I think I can see the arguments for why they've done what they've done.
Can you see those arguments, Zia? Dan Jarvis, the minister there, was saying the government has rejected this advice, adding, as Polly was saying, Islamist extremism followed by far-right extremism are the biggest threats we face. Do you accept that?
That is not supported by the fact. If you look at Hansard, you will see, unfortunately, not trying to trigger anyone, this is just a fact, the vast majority of MI5's caseload is not far-right terrorism, it's Islamist terrorism. So that is a fact, and you can go and look at it on Hansard.
Yeah, but he was... Well...
So that's the first point.
But he said Islamist extremism followed...
We have a government that is willing to do the most extraordinary gymnastics in order to not actually address the problem. This particular report, for example, talked about how it used the word alleged when it was describing the grooming gangs, where there have been hundreds of people who have been convicted of those atrocious crimes. We know there's been an almighty cover-up. Labour have admitted this by doing allowing some partial inquiries, albeit not the full transparent national inquiry that Reform are demanding. So what we have is a government that is willing to essentially sacrificed the lives of its own people, as far as we're concerned, at the altar of this virtue signalling diversity. It's time for common sense. It's time for us to have officials who actually do their jobs in terms of keeping people safe. The final point I'll make is the monster who carried out the Southport attacks was reported to Prevent on 3 separate occasions. Who has been fired at Prevent? Who has paid a price for this inside anywhere inside the state system? Those little girls, it was one of the most atrocious crimes we could ever have imagined.
All right,
There's been nobody, not a single person funded by the taxpayer whose job it was to keep those little girls alive has paid any penalty for.
Well, Polly, and should there be?
Well, I mean, there are 2 things that are going on. There's the review of the Prevent strategy in order to be able to identify where there might have been things that need to change about the way the Prevent programme works. And there is also the public inquiry into all of the state failures that resulted in that. Because there were a number of times when that Southport killer was in contact with state authorities and indeed charities as well, and nothing was done. That is the appalling consequence. Those are the appalling consequences is that atrocity in Southport, and we need to understand where and how people need to take responsibility in order to be able to avoid these kind of things happening in the future. But I would want to clarify on the record and correct the records here that Islamic extremism is one of the #1 priorities of the Home Office, as confirmed just in the Commons by my colleague Dan Jarvis.
Right.
It's that and extreme right terrorism.
What proportion of MI5's caseload is far-right extremism?
I don't know that number. You can ask me that number. But the point is, the Home Office has identified that both of those two...
These are really important matters, with respect. And so by conflating these issues, by chucking far-right in there, it doesn't do anyone any favours. The vast, vast majority, in excess of 90% of MI5's caseload is Islamist terrorism. So throwing in far-right is deeply unhelpful if we want to have...
Well, but it is included. It is included.
It's included in the priorities of the Home Office.
Right.
That is the clarification on the record that I want to make.
Ben, does the definition need to change? Does it need to be expanded?
Well, just to add a slightly different take on it from the report, what I find is, I think it's good that, well, I hope they go all the way and kind of push entirely back against this report, but it's good to hear the government distance itself very, very quickly. What I find interesting about it is this is a report that's been developed within the civil service by officials, and I actually think it shows an insight behind the curtain as to how officialdom has managed this type of process in the future. We can go to the Southport, we can go to multiple public body failures, but it also goes to this kind of stasis. The idea that we should act as extremism when you say that there is 2-tier policing in this country is an absolute farce. If anybody says that there isn't 2-tier policing in this country, they are not telling you the truth. The fact that somebody can go to prison and be arrested for alleging and calling somebody a paedophile online, but actual paedophiles are not going to prison, I'm sorry, but that is a 2-tier system. The fact that the Home Office thinks that now should be regulated and looked at as an extremist view shows where the Home Office is at. And I'm not suggesting that's a political point. I'm suggesting from a civil service Home Office point of view, that is a real problem and a real concern that politicians need to be looking at.
Well, Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, says the officials that produce this factually incorrect garbage, this is the review we're talking about, are unfit to serve the public. They should be fired. Polly?
Well, like I say, I'm not going to make a comment on a report I haven't read. Robert Jenrick is perfectly fine to shoot his mouth off on X or whichever social media platform he's done, but I'm not going to start that.
Naomi?
I think that one thing that gets lost in a lot of this is acknowledging that behaviours are incredibly important in this. And what do I mean when I say behaviours? I do mean that it is incumbent upon not just the government, but everybody, politicians, political commentators, the media, to understand that when they say something or write a column about something, that in itself is a behaviour if it seeks to inflame and cause more social division and put certain communities at risk. Is that extremism? No, of course it isn't. A definition is just a definition. Of course, it means how resources get allocated, and so it has a legal framework there. But no definition is going to please everybody. What matters is that we're addressing the behaviours that cause the harm rather than one based on definitions. And I just would remind people that the language that we all use, particularly those of us on this panel and people that come on this show and people who write in newspapers, need to be really, really careful about the language that they use, because that can tip over into some of the dreadful behaviours that we have seen over the summer riots, etc., that aren't necessarily rooted in ideology.
Well, it may be one of the topics that comes up at Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, will face Kemi Badenoch, Leader of the Opposition, at noon. We'll be on air from 11:15 to bring you all the build-up and reaction to that. So please join join me then. Let's talk about the NHS. We have a headline from BBC News. Streeting, that's Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, accuses Nigel Farage of Reform UK of miserablest vision for the UK. And he said this because he accused Nigel Farage of not believing in a universal health service free at the point of use and of having a poverty of ambition for the UK that Labour, he says, utterly rejects. Now, the accusation that Nigel Farage doesn't believe in a universal health service free at the point of use refers to a comment that he made from the BBC election debates. Let's have a listen.
There are countries right next door to us. There's one country, France, that has a very, very different way of funding the NHS. It's rather like those that can afford, through their taxes, pay into an insurance scheme. Those that can't afford it don't pay in, so it's for the mutual benefit of everybody, and it's managed as if it was a private company, and their returns on stroke, heart and cancer are better than ours for exactly the same sum of money.
Well, let's test that out. We're joined by Sarah Reid, an expert on international healthcare models at the Nuffield Trust. Welcome to you, Sarah. That final sentence of Nigel Farage, is he right that the outcomes in those key indicators, including stroke and heart attacks, are better in France for the same sum of money?
No, I think looking at the evidence, we don't really see that. So it is true that other health systems that have an insurance-based model or a different approach to funding, like France, the Netherlands, Germany, that these health systems do better on some key indicators, cancer survival, rates of death from avoidable causes, these things. But so do other countries that have a system that looks a lot like what we have in the NHS. So Denmark, Sweden, Norway, those are tax-based, universally accessible health systems that also perform better on those indicators. So I don't think I think it would be an oversimplification to say that a certain type of funding model or a certain type of approach to financing healthcare gets us these different outcomes. That's just something we don't really see.
Right, that's on the outcomes. Does it cost the same?
No, I think if anything, what we see in those countries, something that unites them is that they all spend more on healthcare than the UK. The health systems I just described, tax-based or not, those governments are putting more towards their health systems than we are doing in the NHS, and they're getting different things as a result. I think we see in France, if we're going to focus on them as an example, they have more doctors, more nurses, more hospital beds. This might be the reason why these health systems are performing better than we are at the moment here in the NHS.
How much more do they spend, as a sort of ballpark, France, per head, for example, than the NHS?
Yeah, so the French government spends about 26% more per head than we do currently in the NHS.
Right. Thank you. Sarah, stay with us while we talk to our other guests. Zia, respond to that. The outcomes may be better in those key indicators, but it's not down to the model. It's not down to a social insurance model or a tax-based model, and it costs more.
Nigel has been crystal clear that under a reform government, when he's the Prime Minister, the NHS will remain free at the point of use. Both my parents had a career in the NHS. My mum still practices as a nurse. They've given 50 years of service between them as frontline NHS workers. And do you know what they tell me consistently over decades at the dinner table? They've told me we need a lot more frontline NHS workers. We need a lot fewer multi-six-figure salaried administrators. And those administrators have proliferated. Look, the NHS clearly is not working. Everybody watching this at home knows when you try and get a GP appointment, if you try and get a dental appointment, A&E. Last year, the ONS said over 50,000 British people died because of undue waits at A&E. So we absolutely need more hospital beds.
But what I'm trying to test is what Nigel Farage said, which is that if we had a social insurance model, not only would our outcomes be better, it wouldn't cost any more money. And Sarah Reid has quite clearly said that is not the case.
Respect, that's not remotely what Nigel Farage just said. He made an observation about the French system. He did not say that we should replicate that system, nor that it would be better for us in the UK.
So what is the system? So hang on. All right, well, what is the system? What is the system, then, that Nigel Farage is proposing?
Well, we have got, unfortunately, the next general election is years away. We are working really, really hard to ensure that our prescription for fixing the NHS will actually work. I want to make this important point too. Under the Tory government, 14 years, the net population growth was 6.5 million in that time. Do you know how many net new hospital beds were built?
No.
Zero. Not a single one. And you can draw a direct line between
but I
that
want to
and
know
the
what you
50,000
want, because
people died
it's
last
always very easy to criticise and sort of break down what other political parties are proposing and then make a statement. And that, yeah, but hang on, but then make a statement. The implication from Nigel Farage was that France has a better system of healthcare. Not only is it better, but it costs the same as the NHS. Well, we've heard that it may be better in certain indicators, but no better than other countries with a tax-based system, and it costs a lot more. Would you be prepared to spend 26% more per head of population here to get those better outcomes?
I find it extraordinary, the attempt to twist what Nigel has
No,
just said.
I'm not
Nigel
twisting.
made a very specific observation about France, about specific outcomes in specific categories with respect. And you have turned this into
let's
him
play it
saying that
again.
we want a French-style model. That's not what he said.
Let's play the clip and see what people think.
There are countries right next door to us. There's one country, France, that has a very, very different way of funding the NHS. It's rather like those that can afford, through their taxes, pay into an insurance scheme. Those that can't afford it don't pay in, so it's for the mutual benefit of everybody, and it's managed as if it was a private company, and their returns on stroke, heart and cancer are better than ours for exactly the same sum of money.
Is he advocating that system or not?
No, he's making a very specific point about France, and you, with respect, you have turned this into him quote, advocating
everybody
for France.
Everybody would take that. All right. Well, let me just go back.
Nigel has been crystal clear.
Well, it is not crystal clear.
The NHS will remain free at the point of use.
All right. Let me go back to Sarah. Is that possible? Let's say we imagine that Nigel Farage is adopting a French-style social insurance model. Would it be free at the point of use, Sarah?
Well, I think what's interesting using France as an example is that they're also different than the NHS, is they have much broader set of co-payments or user charges than we do in the NHS. So most people in France will pay a flat fee or a percentage of their healthcare costs in addition when they use, when they see their primary care doctor or go to the hospital. Yes, it's true that about 95% of the French population also has a form of insurance to cover the costs of those user payments, but I think this creates a barrier to access for some people in France, particularly the people who have the worst off with the lowest incomes or who are sick or have multiple conditions to navigate. So I think we have to be really careful about what lessons we draw from other countries, and there's always trade-offs involved.
All right.
And yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, Polly, outcomes are better in some of those key indicators, and that will interest a lot of people watching this programme. Should it be looked at?
Well, I just want to get some further clarification from Zia, because at the weekend, no, this is important. At the weekend, Nigel Farage said everything was on the table, including, for example, the French model, which is about £2,000 a year for a pensioner. So I just want to clear up, when Nigel says everything's on the table, is the idea of pensioners paying £2,000 a year extra to cover their health insurance something that would be considered or would be an option for reform?
The NHS will remain free at the point of use
for
everybody when Reform are in government. But let's be really clear about it. The NHS is already broken, partly because of catastrophically poor management and no political leadership, and a population explosion, neither of which is going to change for the next 3 to 4 years. And so we are going to have a policy for the NHS that is going to be fit and ready for when we are going to come into government, which is 3 to 4 years away.
Paid by pensioners as an insurance policy in order for them to bring the others?
The NHS will remain free at the point of use.
So they have to pay extra.
The NHS will remain.
You're not ruling out pensioners paying extra.
No, but let me bring in.
He's not denying it. So pensioners could pay £2,000 extra, or for example the American option, which is £25,000.
All right, you two. I've heard enough from you two. Let's just bring in Ben and Emmy.
If I may, two very quick things. When we talk about key indicators, what we're actually saying is there are lots of other models across the world that keep people alive better than the NHS. Yeah. So there has to be a conversation about how we can improve the NHS. I think Farage was clunky in what he said. I think he did go too far in saying it was about... What I just want to quickly... I think it's really interesting here. This is a bigger problem for reform. Reform are trying to have the cake and eat it here. They're trying to ride two horses. What's really interesting about Reform, there is a section of Reform that is actually quite social democrat. It's actually quite left of centre economically. The likes of Farage and Tice and Rupert Lowe are absolutely not. And I think Farage would go to an insurance-style system. I think Polly's right. But actually, there's a lot of voters who want to vote Reform that don't want to do it.
Is there a problem? I mean, we've run out of time, but is there a problem when you're not honest as a government telling people it would cost more to get those sort of outcomes, whichever way you go, that you would have to cost more?
£25 billion quid in, including with Reform, which is involving community prevention and greater technology.
You've only got about 10.
That's the way we'll put it back in.
We've got to fund the NHS better. It's hugely popular. Any party going to the polls saying that they might do anything to risk it will suffer at the polls.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.